Hello, it's Alister McGrath again, and this is the second of 11 short presentations helping you to use my textbook, Theology, the Basics, which is now in its 4th edition. Now, my topic in this presentation is the nature of faith. What does it mean to believe? And that's a topic of the first chapter of this book. Lots of people think that to believe in God means something like, well, I think there's a God, but I can't be sure about this. And yes, that's the everyday sense of the word, but that doesn't mean it's the Christian sense of the word. The Apostles' Creed opens with the Latin word credo, which is almost always translated as I believe. Yet the proper meaning of the Latin word credo back in the 4th century, when this creed was in the process of emerging, was to trust or confide in a person or thing, or to have confidence in, or to trust. So while we now tend to think of faith in terms of a theoretical judgment, the creeds actually see it as a personal commitment. And the theologian Faustus of Rhegium, writing in the 5th century, explains that to believe in God means to respond to God in worship and adoration by giving ourselves and our affections completely over to God. And that's a great start to our thinking about the nature of faith. And you can see how that links up with the idea of metanoia, this mental transformation that I discussed in the previous presentation. Now, Christian writers down the ages have distinguished two senses of the word faith. First, it means a faith by which we believe. In other words, the act of trust and assent which says yes to God and which reaches out to grasp and hold fast to God as the secure ground of our life and thought. But it also refers to a second sense of faith, to a faith which we believe. In other words, to a set of beliefs, such as those that are set out in the creeds. And in this sense of the word, faith refers to the content of what we believe, rather than the act or attitude of believing and trusting. And in some works of theology, you'll find these two kinds of faith referred to using the Latin terms fides quae creditur, the faith by which we believe, and fides quae creditur, the faith which we believe. Now, this doesn't mean there are two different kinds of faith. One form that trusts in God and one which believes propositions. No. It means that there are two different but inseparable aspects of faith. And the theologian Romanus Cesario points out that the act of faith reaches beyond the formal content of doctrines and attains the very referent, the res ipsa, of theological faith. So let me explain what he means, as I think you find this both interesting and helpful. Cesario is picking up on the theme from the great medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas. And the act of faith, Aquinas remarks, doesn't end with what may be said, but it ends with reality. And Cesario is making the same point. Yes, faith does indeed engage with the core ideas of Christian belief, but it goes through them, it goes beyond them to grasp what those ideas point to, namely the greater reality of God. Now, the Christian creeds think of faith in terms of commitment and entrustment, in which believers place their trust and hope in a trustworthy God. And Christianity is not primarily a set of beliefs to which we must assent, but it's rather a trustworthy and reliable way of thinking and living which we are invited to enter and to embrace. And faith is about taking hold of the reality of God, which is disclosed reliably, yet incompletely, in Christian beliefs. The German theologian Martin Luther is one of many to stress that faith, in the Christian sense of the word, is far more than just passive intellectual assent. It's the means by which Christians take hold of the realities of faith. And Luther puts it like this: true faith is a kind of sure confidence of the heart and a steady assent by which Christ is apprehended. Sure, faith is believing that certain things are true, but there's more to it than that. For Luther, faith is fundamentally trust. And Luther often uses the Latin word fiducia, a word that could be translated as confidence, to denote this aspect of faith he wants to emphasize. Faith is about trusting a God who makes promises and whose promises may be relied upon. For Luther, faith is a relational notion. It's about trusting God and trusting God's promises, and thus receiving what is promised. But this doesn't mean that faith is simply about the personal attitude of trusting God. It's also about trusting a specifically Christian way of seeing ourselves and our world, which we often express in terms of beliefs. But this doesn't mean that faith is simply about the personal attitude of trusting God. It's also about trusting a specifically Christian way of seeing ourselves and our world, which we often express in terms of beliefs. And one of the most important recent discussions of the relation of faith and reason is found in Pope John Paul II's 1998 encyclical letter, known by its Latin term, Fides et Ratio. And that just means faith and reason. And in this letter, John Paul II set out a classic Christian approach to the relation of faith and reason in a very accessible way. For John Paul II, faith and reason can work together. Listen to what he says. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth. In other words, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. And that's a rich and powerful statement, which expresses the basic idea that human beings long to know the truth, and they're constantly searching for it. And John Paul II goes on to say this, something really interesting. In the far reaches of the human heart, there's a seed of desire and nostalgia for God. So, can reason alone lead humanity to find this truth? And John Paul II describes philosophy as one of the noblest of human tasks. It's driven by the desire to discover the ultimate truth of existence. But on its own, unaided, human reason simply cannot fully penetrate to the mystery of life. It cannot answer questions like, why are we here? And for this reason, John Paul II remarks, God graciously chooses to make these things known through revelation, things which would otherwise remain unknown. And he writes these words, the truth made known to us by revelation is neither the product nor the consummation of an argument devised by human reason. Now, John Paul II goes on to suggest that clues to God's existence and nature are built into the fabric of our world and our deepest intuitions. And he appeals to the Apostle Paul's sermon preached at the Areopagus in Athens. And this is set out in chapter 17 of the Acts of the Apostles. And John Paul II says this shows it's entirely reasonable to infer the existence of God from the wonders of nature and from a sense of divinity within each of us. Now, these don't count as proofs of faith, but they are some kind of confirmation or corroboration of the basic themes of faith. Lines of argument a bit like this are developed by John Polkinghorne. Polkinghorne's one of Britain's leading theoretical physicists, and he developed a strong interest in Christian theology late in life. And Polkinghorne points out that Christianity, like the natural sciences, is concerned about making sense of the world on the basis of evidence available to us. And he writes like this, faith is not a question of shutting one's eyes, gritting one's teeth, and believing the impossible. It involves a leap, but a leap into the light rather than the dark. So for Polkinghorne, faith is to be understood as motivated belief, based on evidence. Faith is rigorously based on reflection on the world, such as the various clues it offers to its origins and nature. Faith isn't blind trust opposed to the evidence of the world, although it's true that some very aggressive atheists suggest that all faith is blind faith. And that, I think, overlooks a lot of their own unacknowledged moral and intellectual beliefs. Atheists believe things as well. So, can we prove God's existence? Or can only shallow truths be proved in this way? And most theologians take the view that the existence of God is something that reason can't prove conclusively. Yet, the fact that the existence of God lies beyond reason does not for one moment mean that the existence of God is contrary to reason. Certainly, very good reasons can be given for suggesting that God exists, but these don't, however, count as proofs in the sense of rigorous logical demonstrations or conclusive scientific experiments. I hope this introductory material will help you get the most out of engaging with this first chapter in this book. So let's look at the structure of this chapter in Theology, the Basics in more detail, and look at the questions we'll be exploring. We begin by looking at the question, what is faith? And then move on to this really interesting question, can God's existence be proved? It's a classic question, and the answers people to give today are really interesting. But we still need to ask another question, which is the next section in this chapter. Are proofs of God's existence actually any use? Who finds them helpful? And that's a really interesting question. So we then begin to explore this general proposition. Yes, faith is beyond reason, but it's not contrary to reason. And then picking up on this theme of faith as trust, we look at the relationship between faith and the promises of God. And then move on to look at the question, the whole problem of suffering, which brings up this question of faith and doubt. It's a big issue, well worth looking at. Now, every chapter in this volume ends with a text that we can engage with, and this chapter is no exception. And to bring this chapter on faith to a close, we look at John Calvin on the nature of faith. Now, there's a lot more that needs to be said about faith than I've said in this presentation. In fact, the whole question of the rationality of faith is fascinating, and I think you'll enjoy exploring it. And I'll leave you to work your way through this chapter. And once you've done that, we can move on and turn our attention to the Christian idea of God, which is the topic of the next presentation. And I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.